Well, it was another night of protests across the United States demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. You're looking at Louisville, Kentucky, where more than 500 people took to the streets last night. This is where Taylor was shot and killed by police in her own home back in March. Protesters gathering for nearly an hour, but dispersing by 9 p.m. when the curfew set in. Both city and state police and U.S. National Guard vehicles drove by the area to ensure people were following orders. Louisville police tweeting that protesters set fires, broke windows, and destroyed property, and that more arrests would be made. Nationwide, across the United States, protests have been ongoing following a grand jury decision not to indict 3 police officers connected to Taylor's death. Well, Cornell Brooks is a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and the former president of the NAACP. He joins us right now in Manassas, Virginia. Cornell, thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be with you, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin by asking you what you think, or at least how you think, the decision regarding the indictments in the Breonna Taylor case will actually affect voter outcome. We've been seeing these protests going on in the United States, not just because of Breonna Taylor, but really years, as you know, of police violence against African Americans. Will it inspire African American voters to come out, or will the decision around Breonna Taylor further discourage African American voters from taking part?
So, we begin by noting the fact that much of the country and certainly the family of Breonna Taylor is traumatized by a grand jury decision that feels like an act of violence. That is to say, violating the conscience of the country in terms of justice for Breonna Taylor's family in the wake of her literally senseless death. But to your question, I would expect this decision, which literally feels like an act of violence, to ignite and inspire, enrage, and motivate people to go to the polls. Why? Because the country literally is facing a choice between a presidential nominee, Joe Biden, who is championing reimagining police transformation and reform on one hand, and President Donald J. Trump, who has literally been a cheerleader for police brutality, calling for thugs to be roughed out, championing white supremacy, saying to police officers that they should get rough with people who are arrested. The choice cannot be more clear. This is an existential choice between literally more of the same and something different. We are on schedule to have more people killed at the hands of the police this year than the previous year. We cannot go into 2021 with the status quo as bloody and as brutal as it has been. And so I believe African Americans, among others, particularly young voters, will be inspired to go to the polls and vote against this president and the present way of doing things.
It's interesting that you note young voters, because we've been speaking to demonstrators, protesters in the United States since the killing of George Floyd, and there has been almost this generational divide between the African American voters that we've spoken to, mainly older, who are mobilizing to vote for Biden and Harris. But at the same time, younger voters who really seem disillusioned at this point, never really believing that any vote they cast will actually have a government that would address the core issues of racial inequality in the United States. So it's interesting that you say young voters, because it seems we're also noting a level of disencouragement, if you will.
Sure. There's a certain measure of discouragement and a certain measure of disenchantment and disappointment with this grand jury decision, with the president's state of affairs, with a long list of human beings reduced to hashtags in and at the feet of police brutality. That said, when you look at the polling, young voters are incredibly motivated to vote, incredibly inspired to vote. We're seeing that all across the country. And so, yes, they are disappointed, and rightly so. Yes, they are discouraged, and perhaps rightly so. But that being said, the same people who are out in the middle of a pandemic, protesting, demonstrating all across the country, particularly in the wake of the George Floyd's death and Rayshard Brooks's death and Ahmaud Arbery's death, and certainly Breonna Taylor's death, the same young people who are out day after day in literally America's largest ongoing protest and demonstration, many of those protesters and demonstrators will be voters. So be clear about this. If you went back to 1965 and you asked John Lewis after he was beaten down on the Edmund Pettus Bridge as a young person, are you dispirited? Are you discouraged? Perhaps. But they fought for the right to vote and they voted. We expect no less from this generation. And one can be dispirited in one moment, brave, courageous, and determined in the next. And I expect that moment to be the first Tuesday in November.
You know, this next question I want to ask you, and acknowledging the fact that one cannot look at a whole people, the African American people, and have a monolithic outcome in how they're going to vote. But I do wonder, when you look at key ridings, key states, key counties even in the United States, more importantly, how do you think African American voters will sway that vote? Because it does come down to a few states at the end of the day.
It does indeed. And what we see at this very moment is literally resources by the certainly color of change, Black Voters Matter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP, the Lawyers Committee, so many groups and organizations across the country that are both protecting the vote and mobilizing to turn out the vote in key states. And African Americans understand more than most that when it comes to this democracy, we are literally facing an existential choice as grave as climate change in this moment, at this time. So the people understand what's at stake in these key states, in these key counties. So people are working extraordinarily hard. I'm just hoping that we continue to spend the money, devote the resources, put the people in the field, maintain and intensify our ground game online and on the street and in person, and most assuredly protecting the right to vote, which is to say, we know the same president who's talking about voter fraud is engaged in voter suppression. This we know. So we've got to protect the vote and turn out the vote in the same breath at the same time.
Cornell Brooks, really good to have you in the program today. Thank you for that.
Always good to be with you.
And that's Cornell Brooks, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, also the former president of the NAACP.